ונשמח בדברי סוירוסךו ובמצוותיךו לעולם ועד. 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 כי הם חייני ויורך יומייני יבואם נגד יומם ועד.
Hello everyone, this is the third in the series of behavior during laning, and today I'd like to deal not so much with the question, but the fundamentals that come out of it. Namely, not so much with the actual technical detail I'm about to present, but more, what does it teach us about laning in general? So, as you recall last time, we brought various heterim that the Shulchan Aruch paskins regarding learning Torah during laning, and allow me to quote two of them. One of them was that you can learn quietly, but not out loud, so you don't disturb people, and echoed by the Rosh. And number two, if there's 10 people that listen, you don't have to be number 11. Comes along the Shibbolei Haleket and asks the following fundamental question. Miud tema, this actually makes no sense to me. Shegam hu mitzvah lishmoa kriyas haTorah. I don't understand. The guy that's learning Torah very quietly, or he's not even listening because 10 others are listening. Doesn't he have an obligation to hear the laning? Dichtivo znei kol ha'amel sefer haTorah. The pasuk that the Gemara quoted in Sota was, all the ears were to the Torah reading. So his ears are not to the Torah reading. He's in his own world. Especially Rav Sheshet, who turned his back, totally saying, this is not for me. If he looks in his book, be it a Gemara, a Mishnah, whatever he's learning, a Parsha sheet, he's not going to be paying attention to laning. And therefore, says the Shibbolei Haleket, Hilkach Nira, therefore it looks to me, she asur, that would be totally forbidden. So indeed, how do these heterim work? If we're obligated to hear Kriyas HaTorah, then how exactly are we allowed to learn if there's 10 people listening, if we do it quietly, whatever? So, I believe that this brings a very fundamental question regarding what is Kriyas HaTorah. And allow me to bring an answer. I didn't bring class, it's not Paskint in Shulchan Aruch, and that is Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah, as well as other Rishonim say, Rav Sheshet, who turned his back and said, you're doing your thing, I'm doing my thing, was a very special case. Why was he a special case? Because he was what's called in the halacha sagina hor. He was blind. Because he was blind, lo haya mechuyav bekriyas haTorah, the dvarim shenitnu bichtav yeta rashai lomran ba'al peh. If you're blind, you cannot potentially read the Torah. If you're not getting an aliyah, you're not obligated in hearing the Torah reading. But, he says, Adam acher she'orev chayav bekriyas haTorah, asur lesaper afil shetorato emunato. But all the heterim got off the books if you're not blind. So Rav Yosef Engel, who one was the biggest lamdanim of the 19th century, comes along and says, Nistapakti mitzvat kriyas haTorah ma'in yana. What exactly is this kriyas haTorah thing? Hayim achiyuvu av shmiya letvira Torah hanikraim. Is the obligation of the congregation to listen to the Torah reading? O shebe'emet mechuyavin kol echad ve'echad likrot rak she'hakoreh motzi otam b'kriyato. Or maybe the mitzvah is not to listen, but actually to read it yourself. But there could only be one guy laning and one guy getting an aliyah at most. So we are all yotze by virtue of that guy, by the ironclad rule called shomeya ke'oneh. When you hear it, it's like you say it. But theoretically, each and every person has to read. And therefore, it says Rav Engel, I can bring 25 nafkaminas, and one of them is this one. If Rav Sheshet was indeed blind, then we have the following nafkamina. If the mitzvah is to hear, he would be obligated, because only his eyes don't work, but his ears work very well. If, on the other hand, the mitzvah is to read, and he's not able to read potentially, then he would be exempt from the Torah reading. And indeed, the Gdolei HaPoskim come down on this issue on both sides. Namely, is the Torah reading an actual mitzvah to read from the Torah, like it is a mitzvah to read the Megillah on Purim? But we have one guy do it on our behalf. Or no? The mitzvah is just to hear it, like shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, if you can hear, you'd be obligated even if you can't blow. Comes along the Ben Ish Chai and says, not only is the first side correct, but I'm going to paskin on this exactly the same question with a guy that can't hear. If a guy can't hear because he is deaf, can he learn during Kriyas Torah? So he brings this Rav Sheshet, he brings this point of view that he was blind, and he says, now you understand why he said, Ana bedidan ve'inhu bedideyu. I'm doing my thing, you're doing your thing, because I'm not obligated to listen to the Kriyas Torah, because the mitzvah is to listen. And therefore he says, if you can't hear, then quite frankly, you're not obligated in Kriyas HaTorah. However, comes the Shut Mahari Mibruna, a little less known figure, but we're talking about the Mahari Mibruna, who was one of the Gdolim of Ashkenaz, Rabbi Yisrael bar Rabbi Chaim, his years 1400 to 1480, tip end of the Rishonim period, a Talmud of the Tumas Hadeshen, a Talmud of the Mahari Vial, and he quotes the Mahari Vial that comes along and says, "Hashamei min hakora kriyas haTorah b'Beit HaKnesset, im yoseh bezeh hapam, im yilchem mikra v'shuv lo yitzarech likro shtayim mikra v'echad targum, ela mikra hapam achat." If during the Laining you hear the Torah reading, do you still have to do Shtayim Mikra Ve'echad Targum, read every pasuk twice with its translation as we're obligated to do each week? And he says, yes, because Kriyas HaTorah has nothing to do with learning. Lo yatsa, mishum de lo kaima beBeit HaKnesset rak l'shmiya ve'lo l'kriya. The mitzvah is the first side of Rav Engel's Chakira. Namely, the mitzvah is to hear, not to learn. When you go home and you take out a chumash and you do Shtayim Mikra V'Echad Targum, that's called learning Torah. When you're in shul, the mitzvah is to hear the Torah reading and only to hear the Torah reading. Totally different mitzvah. It's to hear the Torah reading publicly in a synagogue. It is not learning Torah. And therefore, even a guy who, say, is blind, cannot learn Torah, but he is not deaf, he would be obligated in the Kriyas HaTorah. So, and therefore explains the Mahari Bruna. This is why the Gemara says in Masechet Megillah that someone under Bar Mitzvah can get an Aliyah. How can someone under Bar Mitzvah get an Aliyah? After all, he's not obligated yet in Mitzvah. And we have an ironclad rule, whoever is not obligated in the mitzvah cannot fulfill the obligation for someone that is. He comes and says, with due respect, Torah l'shmiya kaima, ve'ino bracha levatala. The whole mitzvah is to hear the Torah reading. And quite frankly, you hear it by the laner. The fact that the guy gets an aliyah and says whatever he says, that makes no difference. As a matter of fact, he doesn't say Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvot havetzivanu, you have obligated me, but rather Asher b'charbanu. And from this perspective, that explains why even a kid under bar mitzvah can get an aliyah, because the mitzvah is just to hear the laning. You hear it. It's not that each and every person has to read, and therefore we need to have someone up there that actually knows how to read. Even if it's someone under bar mitzvah, it would be okay, because we could see a very small little issue. A guy was blind, brought up a much bigger issue of what is the point of Kriyas HaTorah when we do it. Is it just to hear the Torah reading, like there's a mitzvah to hear shofar, not to blow it, but to hear it? That's the way we paskin. That's the bracha we make, lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the shofar, not necessarily to blow it. Or no, it's a mitzvah for each and every person to read, but we have one laner. If it's a mitzvah that each and every person to read, then the exemptions would be for anyone that can't read. But if the mitzvah is to hear, the only exemption would be someone that can't hear. But if someone can hear and can't see, then he'd be obligated in Kriyas HaTorah.